The hand was small, 7 years and 4 months old, according to the file that would later be unsealed, but in the dim light of the Greasy Spoon diner, it looked impossibly fragile, like a bird's wing. It trembled, not from the chill of the October morning that seeped through the window panes, but from a cold that lived inside the bones. The boy, Leo, weighed 52 pounds, a fact noted with clinical precision by a school nurse who never once looked him in the eye. He wore a blue-collared shirt, frayed at the cuffs, and gray trousers with knees worn thin from hours spent kneeling, not in prayer, but in hiding. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were fixed on the table's chipped formica surface. He could not look up. He could not meet the gaze of the man who sat opposite him. The man's hand was a different geography entirely. It was a landscape of scars and calluses, the knuckles like worn river stones, the skin tanned and cracked from sun and engine grease. A silver ring, shaped like a snarling wolf's head, adorned his right hand. The hand rested beside a coffee mug, thick and white, and it did not move. It was a study in stillness, a mountain waiting for the tremor from the small bird's wing. The man's name was Marcus Thorne, but no one had called him that in 20 years. They called him Grizz. At 6'4" and 280 pounds of weathered muscle and regret, the name fit. His leather cut was heavy with the weight of patches that told a story of miles traveled and brotherhoods forged. Hell's Angels, nomads, a memorial patch for a brother lost on a highway outside Flagstaff, and another, smaller one, over his heart, a simple black square with a single white teardrop. Leo's small hand, holding a folded, sweat-dampened piece of notebook paper, slid across the table. It was a journey of 12 inches that felt like 1,000 miles. It pushed the note until it touched the man's waiting hand. The contact was electric, a current of pure, distilled terror passed from the child to the man. Grizz didn't flinch. His eyes, hidden in the shade of a heavy brow, flickered down to the note, then back to the top of the boy's head, to the swirl of his brown hair. He did not speak. He simply unfolded the paper. The words were written in the shaky, deliberate pencil strokes of a child trying desperately to be neat, to be clear, to be believed. He has keys to our rooms at night. The janitor, Mr. Prentice. He watches us when we sleep, the quiet rooms, the ones at the end of the hall. Please, help us. Grizz read the words once, then a second time. The air in the diner seemed to thin, the clatter of plates and the low hum of conversation fading into a distant roar. He felt a familiar coldness spread through his chest, the same ice that had formed 22 years ago on a different Tuesday, when a different system had failed a different child. His child. He folded the note with a precision that defied the size of his hands and tucked it into the inner pocket of his cut, placing it next to the worn leather of his wallet. He placed it over his heart, a promise made without a single word spoken. Then he looked at Leo. For the first time, the boy risked a glance upward, and in the man's eyes, he did not see anger or disbelief. He saw a terrible, quiet calm, a stillness that was more frightening, more powerful than any shout. Grizz leaned forward, the leather of his jacket groaning. He spoke, his voice a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep underground. I believe you. 4 words. That's all. It was more than Leo had heard from any adult in his entire life. It was everything. And in that moment, a contract was signed in the silent language of the desperate and the damned. A vow was made. A clock began to tick, counting down to a single, inevitable night. A night that would come 6 weeks later. A Friday. The air temperature would be 34 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind from the north at 7 miles per hour. a night when 182 motorcycles would cut their engines 1.2 miles from the Northwood Academy for Exceptional Youth, their chrome glinting under a sliver of moon. Their riders, men and women from 7 different states, would not make a sound as they dismounted. They were not there as a gang. They were not there as outlaws. They were there as witnesses. They moved with a chilling, silent purpose, forming a perfect, inescapable perimeter around the sprawling brick building. Each of them had a position. Each of them had a task, and each of them was connected by a singular, encrypted radio frequency, waiting for a single word of command. They had come to catch a ghost on camera, to prove that the monsters who haunt children do not always have claws and fangs. Sometimes they have keys. Sometimes they mow their lawns on Sundays and wave to their neighbors. And sometimes the only people who will stop them are the ones the world has already written off. This is the story of how they did it. This is the story of what they saw. The Northwood Academy for Exceptional Youth stood on a hill overlooking the town of Havenwood, its red brick facade and manicured lawns a carefully constructed lie. It was sold to desperate parents as a sanctuary, a place where children with unique challenges could find structure and support. The brochure, printed on heavy, glossy cardstock, featured smiling children engaged in art therapy and playing on a state-of-the-art jungle gym. It cost parents like Sarah Jenkins, Leo's mother, $32,000 a year, a sum she paid by working a nursing shift and a night-stocking job, her life a blur of exhaustion and the metallic smell of hospital disinfectant. She sent Leo there because a state-funded child psychologist, a man with kind eyes and a framed diploma from a prestigious university, told her it was Leo's best chance. He had said Leo was selectively mute and suffered from oppositional defiant disorder. What he failed to note in his 7-page report was that Leo was simply terrified. The hallways of Northwood smelled of pine sol and boiled cabbage. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights overhead in a way that made you feel like you were walking on water, about to drown. There were 42 rooms in the residential wing, divided into 2 halls, Blue Hall and Green Hall. The rooms were identical. A single bed with a thin mattress and a blue blanket, a small wooden desk, a chair, and a window that was bolted shut. There were no curtains. Curtains, the director explained on orientation day, were a ligature risk. Leo lived in room 17 of Blue Hall. His world was one of rigid schedules, measured in the ringing of bells. 6:30 a.m., wake up. 7 a.m., breakfast in the cafeteria. Oatmeal on Mondays and Wednesdays, powdered eggs on Tuesdays and Thursdays. 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., classes. 3:30 p.m., supervised recreation. 5:30 p.m., dinner. 7 p.m., study hall. 8:30 p.m., prepare for bed. 9 p.m., lights out. The precision was supposed to be calming. For Leo, it was a cage built of minutes and seconds. He had learned the art of being invisible. He was small for his age, and he made himself smaller, hunching his shoulders, keeping his eyes on the scuffed toes of his shoes. He never spoke in class. He never raised his hand. He ate his meals quickly, methodically, without tasting the food. His invisibility was a shield. But it wasn't perfect. The fear had a name. It was Mr. Prentice. Arthur Prentice, the night janitor. He was 58 years old, had worked at Northwood for 17 of them, and had a perfect employment record. He was a thin, stooped man with watery blue eyes and hair the color of dishwater. He moved through the silent halls after lights out, his presence announced by the soft squeak of his rubber-soled shoes and the gentle metallic jingle of the brass ring of keys clipped to his belt. There were 34 keys on that ring, one for every door. Leo's trauma was not written in bruises or cuts. It was written in his behaviors. It was in the way he barricaded his door every night at 9:02 p.m., pushing his little wooden desk against it, a futile gesture that he knew would do nothing but offered a sliver of psychological defense. It was in the way he never fully slept, but drifted in a state of hyper-vigilant twilight, his ears tuned to the sound of footsteps in the hall. It was in the collection of small objects he kept hidden in a loose floorboard beneath his bed. A sharpened piece of a plastic fork, a shard of glass from a broken bottle he'd found in the yard, a rusty nail. They weren't weapons. They were anchors. Objects whose sharp reality could pull him back from the spiraling dread. A small, secret pain to distract from a larger, unspeakable one. The other children felt it too, the ones in the quiet rooms, as Leo had written. The rooms at the far end of the hall, near the fire exit, where the overnight staff supervisor rarely patrolled. These were the rooms of the other invisible children, the ones who didn't have parents who called every week, the ones whose files were thicker, whose disorders were more pronounced. They communicated their shared terror in fleeting glances across the cafeteria, in the almost imperceptible tensing of a shoulder when the jingle of keys grew near. They were a silent congregation of the afraid. Leo had a bedwetting problem. The school called it nocturnal enuresis and treated it as a behavioral issue. They made him wash his own sheets in a deep industrial sink in the laundry room, his small hands struggling with the heavy, wet fabric. But it wasn't a behavioral issue. It happened only on the nights after Mr. Prentice's key had turned in his lock. The door would open just a crack, a sliver of dim hallway light cutting into the darkness, and the janitor would just stand there, sometimes for a minute, sometimes for 5, a silhouette in the doorway, watching. The air would grow thick and heavy, smelling faintly of sour breath and the chemical sweetness of his hand soap. He never came in. He never spoke. He just watched, and the sheer, silent violation of it was a poison that seeped into Leo's sleep, into his soul. Then the door would click shut, and the only sound would be the jingle of keys fading down the hall and the frantic, rabbit heartbeat in Leo's own chest. That was when the warmth would spread across the thin mattress, followed by the cold, deep shame. He wasn't just being watched, he was being broken, piece by silent piece. Marcus Thorne, the man they called Grizz, owned a garage on the industrial edge of town called Resurrection Motors. The name was not an accident. He took wrecked machines, twisted frames and shattered engines, and brought them back to life. He found solace in the logic of mechanics, in the way every part had a purpose, every problem a solution. You could diagnose a faulty engine. You could replace a worn-out clutch. You could weld a fractured frame until it was stronger than before. You couldn't do that with a human heart. You couldn't do that with memory. His garage was a cavern of organized chaos. Vintage motorcycle frames hung from the rafters like steel skeletons. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline, hot metal, and the dark, rich scent of brewing coffee. His hands, which could diagnose an engine's misfire by touch alone, were rarely still. He worked with a ferocious, focused energy, a man trying to outrun a ghost that lived inside his own head. The ghost had a name, Daniel. His son. Danny had been 8 years old, a bright, funny kid with a gap-toothed smile and a love for comic books. 22 years ago, a teacher at Danny's school had noticed bruises. The teacher told the principal. The principal called Child Protective Services. A caseworker had visited Danny's mother, Marcus's ex-wife, who was deep in the grip of an addiction he hadn't understood until it was too late. The caseworker, a 24-year-old with a sociology degree and an overwhelming caseload, had filed a report. She noted the mother was stressed but coping. She recommended parenting classes. 3 weeks later, Danny was dead. An accident, the official report said. Fell down the stairs. Marcus had been overseas at the time, on his third tour. He came home in a C-130, his uniform stiff with desert dust, to a world that had been shattered. He went to war with the system. He screamed at the principal, who hid behind liability forms. He confronted the caseworker, who cried and said she had 150 other cases. He sat through a trial where his ex-wife's boyfriend, a man with a history of violence, was acquitted due to lack of evidence. The system hadn't just failed. It had actively protected the guilty through its own incompetence and indifference. It was a machine designed not for justice, but for self-preservation. That was the day Marcus Thorne died and Grizz was born. He left the military, drifted for years, and finally found a home in the roaring defiance of a motorcycle engine and the unwavering loyalty of the club. The law was a suggestion. The code was everything. Protect the vulnerable. Avenge the wronged. Never, ever look away. His Saturday morning ritual at the Greasy Spoon was a pilgrimage. It was the last place he'd seen Danny. They'd shared a plate of pancakes there before he'd deployed for the last time. Danny had drowned his in syrup, making a sticky, happy mess. So every Saturday for 22 years, Grizz sat in the same booth, ordered a black coffee and a short stack of pancakes he never ate, and stared at the empty seat across from him. It was an act of remembrance, a penance. He was paying a debt to a ghost. He didn't know Leo, had never seen the boy before. But when that small, trembling hand pushed the note across the table, he didn't see a stranger. He saw Danny. He saw the same terror in the eyes, the same silent plea that had gone unanswered 2 decades before. The note was not just a piece of paper. It was a second chance, a chance to answer a call he had missed once before. The coldness that spread through his chest was not just rage. It was purpose. The ghost in his head was finally quiet. It wasn't asking for vengeance anymore. It was asking for protection. When he looked at Leo and said, "I believe you," it was not just a statement to the boy. It was an oath to his son. This time, there would be no report filed and forgotten. There would be no overwhelmed caseworker. There would be no system to hide behind. This time, the witnesses would not be silenced. He tucked the note into his cut, the paper crinkling against the leather. It felt warm against his chest, a single ember in the frozen landscape of his grief. The waitress came by and refilled his coffee. She glanced at the untouched pancakes. "Everything okay, Grizz?" she asked. He looked up at her, and for the first time in years, the haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a hard, clear light. "It's about to be," he said. The engine of his Harley roared to life in the parking lot 10 minutes later, a sound that wasn't just combustion, but a declaration of war. The resurrection had begun. Before the note, before the diner, there was the whisper. It happened in the infirmary, a sterile white room that smelled of rubbing alcohol and despair. Leo had faked a fever, pressing a hot water bottle to his forehead for 10 minutes in the bathroom before reporting to the nurse. He needed to talk to someone, anyone, outside the suffocating ecosystem of the dorms. His target was Ms. Albright. She was new, 23 years old, fresh out of her teaching program, her spirit not yet entirely crushed by the Northwood machine. She still had a light in her eyes. She sometimes smiled at the children. Leo sat on the edge of the examination bed, the paper crinkling beneath him. Ms. Albright took his temperature. 98.8 degrees. You don't feel warm, Leo, she said, her voice gentle. He didn't look at her. He looked at a poster on the wall showing the food pyramid. It's at night, he said. His voice was a dry rasp, unused. What is, sweetie? Mr. Prentice, the janitor. He comes in our rooms. Mrs. Albright froze. Her training had included a 2-hour seminar on mandatory reporting. She remembered flow charts and legal statutes. She looked at Leo, at his hunched shoulders, and the dark circles under his eyes. What does he do, Leo? She asked, her own voice dropping to a whisper. He just watches from the door. He has the keys, all the keys. There it was, a disclosure. Ms. Albright felt a spike of adrenaline, a mix of fear and a fierce protective instinct. She did exactly what the manual said to do. She documented the conversation word for word in a formal incident report. She noted the time, 2:17 p.m. The date, September 12th. She signed it and, as protocol demanded, she walked it directly to the office of the school's director, Mr. Alistair Finch. Alistair Finch was a man who looked like he was carved from polished mahogany. His suits were tailored, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his smile a masterpiece of insincere reassurance. His office was a shrine to his own success, filled with leather-bound books he'd never read and awards for excellence in alternative education. He had been the director of Northwood for 25 years. He considered the school not an institution, but a brand, and his primary job was brand management. He read Ms. Albright's report, his expression unchanging. He tented his fingers, a gesture he'd perfected to project thoughtful authority. Thank you for your diligence, Ms. Albright, he said, his voice smooth as silk. I'll handle this personally. You've done your duty. She felt a wave of relief. She had done the right thing. The system was working. She left his office feeling like she had protected Leo. She was wrong. The next day, Leo was summoned to the director's office. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. Mr. Finch sat behind his enormous desk, a single lamp illuminating his face, leaving Leo in the shadows. He didn't ask Leo to sit. Leo, Mr. Finch began, his voice losing its silken edge, replaced by a tone of cold disappointment. Ms. Albright tells me you've been telling stories about Mr. Prentice. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. He stared at the intricate pattern on the Persian rug. He has keys, Leo mumbled. Mr. Finch sighed, a sound of profound weariness. Mr. Prentice has keys because he is the janitor, Leo. It is his job to ensure the building is secure. Sometimes that means checking that doors are locked. Boys have active imaginations, especially boys with your history. We've read your file. You have a tendency toward fantasy, toward making things up for attention. It was a perfectly executed maneuver. He was not just dismissing the claim, he was pathologizing the victim. He was using the very challenges the school was paid to treat as a tool to discredit him. I'm not making it up, Leo whispered. Let me be very clear, the director said, leaning forward. His voice dropped lower, becoming a sharp, menacing point. Arthur Prentice has been a loyal employee of this institution for 17 years. He is a good man. You, on the other hand, have been here for 7 months. If I hear another word of these fantasies, we will have to have a conversation with your mother about whether Northwood is the right place for you. Perhaps a more secure facility would be better. Do you understand me? Leo understood. The threat was clear. He would be sent away somewhere worse, and it would be his fault. He would be the reason his mother's money was wasted, her sacrifices made meaningless. He was trapped. He nodded, a single jerky movement. "Good," Mr. Finch said, leaning back, the smile returning to his face. "Now run along. We'll forget this little chat ever happened." System failure number 1 was complete. Failure number 2 came via a telephone line, stretching 482 miles to a small apartment that smelled of burnt coffee and bleach. Sarah Jenkins called the school every Sunday at 4 p.m. sharp to speak with Leo. The calls were stilted, awkward. She would ask about his classes, about the food. He would give one-word answers. She interpreted his silence as adjustment, as him settling in. She wanted to believe it so badly. But after Leo's meeting with Finch, the tone of the calls changed. She could hear a new layer of fear in his silence. She pressed him. "Is everything okay, honey? Is someone bothering you?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then a tiny, choked sound that was almost a sob. "I want to come home." Alarm bells went off in Sarah's head. A mother's intuition is a primal, powerful force. The next morning, she called Director Finch. She was polite, deferential, terrified of jeopardizing Leo's place at the best school. She relayed her concerns. Leo sounded scared. He said he wanted to come home. Finch was a master of soothing worried parents. He pulled up Leo's file as they spoke. "Ah, Mrs. Jenkins. Yes. We've noticed a bit of regression in Leo lately. It's quite common. A delayed onset homesickness. He's testing boundaries. It's actually a sign of progress in a way. He's learning to express his dissatisfaction, which for a boy like Leo is a breakthrough. The best thing we can do is maintain consistency. A firm, steady hand." He was brilliant. He took her concern and reframed it as a positive milestone. He used the jargon of his profession like a shield and a sword. "But what if something is wrong?" She persisted, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "What if he's not safe?" "Mrs. Jenkins," Alistair Finch said, his voice dripping with condescending patience. "Northwood has a 30-year unblemished safety record. My staff are vetted, background checked, and rigorously trained. Your son is safer here than he would be in a public school, I can assure you of that. He is in the best possible hands." The phrase hung in the air. The best possible hands. Sarah hung up the phone feeling confused, placated, and deeply, deeply guilty. Who was she to question the expert, the man with the awards and the fancy school? She was just a tired nurse. She was paying him to be right. So she did nothing. She convinced herself it was just homesickness. She chose to believe the lie because the truth was too terrifying to contemplate. The system had failed again, not with a bang, but with a smooth, reassuring lie down a telephone line. Leo was well and truly alone, and the nights continued to get colder. Arthur Prentice lived in a small, tidy bungalow on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the academy. The lawn was cut in perfect straight lines every Saturday afternoon. In the winter, his driveway was the first on the block to be shoveled. He had a wife, a pale, nervous woman named Eleanor, who worked part-time at the town library. They had no children. Neighbors described Arthur as quiet, a man who kept to himself. He'd give you a little wave if he was getting the mail. That was all. He was a ghost in his own neighborhood, a blank space, the perfect camouflage. His evil was not born of rage or passion. It was a creeping, insidious fungus that grew in the dark, damp places of his soul. It was an addiction to a specific, pathetic form of power, the power of the key, the power to cross a threshold, to stand in a private space, unseen, unheard, the power to watch a child sleep, to own that moment of absolute vulnerability. It was a theft of the most intimate kind, the theft of security. Through the grainy black and white feed of the hidden cameras that would later be installed, his routine would be laid bare with chilling mundanity. At 11:05 p.m., he would finish his duties in the cafeteria. At 11:15 p.m., he would begin his rounds in the administrative wing, emptying trash cans, his movements slow and methodical. It wasn't until after midnight that he would make his way to the residential halls. He favored Blue Hall. He would start at the near end, his footsteps soft on the linoleum. He would pause at certain doors. The cameras would capture him consulting a small dog-eared notebook he kept in his breast pocket. In it were names: Leo, Anna, Daniel, Chloe. The children in the quiet rooms, the invisible ones, the ones whose parents didn't call, whose files showed a history of instability. He had chosen his victims with the care of a predator selecting the weakest from the herd. Tonight, his target was room 17. Leo's room. The camera, hidden in the grill of an air vent, recorded it all. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read 12:38 a.m. The sound was faint, but clear. The almost silent turn of the key in the lock. The soft click as the latch disengaged. The door opened 4 inches, a sliver of light. Then his face, partially obscured, peering into the darkness. He stood there for 3 minutes and 22 seconds. He did not move. He just looked. The camera, sensitive to infrared light, showed the small lump under the blanket. It showed the slight rise and fall of the child's breathing. Prentice's own breathing was inaudible. He was a statue, a voyeur collecting moments of stolen innocence. Then, as silently as he appeared, he pulled the door shut. The lock clicked. The footsteps receded. The hallway was empty again, but the poison remained. The catalyst for everything that followed was a series of small, unconnected misfortunes. A case of the seasonal flu and a nail in a tire. Leo's aunt, his mother's sister, was the one who usually took him for his weekly treat. A burger, a milkshake, a brief 2-hour escape from Northwood. But on this Saturday in October, she woke up with a fever of 102. She called a friend, a neighbor, and begged her to pick Leo up instead. The neighbor agreed, but on her way to the academy, her front right tire went flat on the interstate. By the time the tow truck came, it was too late. So Leo sat alone in the booth at the Greasy Spoon Diner, a voucher for 1 meal clutched in his hand. The waitress, a kind woman named Flo, had brought him a Coke. He was supposed to be picked up at 10 a.m. It was now 11:15 a.m. He was a small island in a sea of Saturday morning chatter. Every minute that ticked by, the dread grew. He would have to go back. He would have to call the school, and they would send a van, and there would be questions. There would be trouble. He felt a familiar panic begin to crawl up his throat. And then he saw him. In the corner booth, the one that was always occupied by the giant silent man with the leather jacket. He'd seen him here before, on other Saturdays. The man always scared him. He was huge, covered in tattoos of skulls and flames. But today, Leo noticed something else. A patch on the front of his vest, over his heart. It wasn't a skull. It was an angel. A fierce-looking angel with a drawn sword, its wings spread wide. It looked like a protector. Desperation is a powerful fuel. It can make a mouse roar. It can make a terrified boy cross a diner and stand before a mountain of a man. Leo's mind raced. The teachers hadn't listened. The director hadn't listened. His own mother couldn't help. The system was a series of locked doors. But this man looked like he didn't care about doors. He looked like he could walk right through them. He thought of the nights, of the jingle of keys, of the shadow in the doorway. He thought of Anna in room 19, who had started pulling her own hair out. He thought of Daniel in room 21, who had stopped speaking entirely. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them. He took a deep breath. He stood up. His legs felt like they were made of wood. He walked the 20 feet to the corner booth. He stood by the table, his head barely reaching the tabletop. The man looked up from his coffee. His eyes were not mean. They were just sad. Leo could not speak. The words were trapped behind a wall of fear. But his hand, his small, trembling hand, held the note he had written the night before, after Prentice had visited his room again. He had used the last of his hoarded courage to write it. He held it out. Grizz looked from the boy's terrified face to the offered piece of paper. He had been staring at the ghost of his own son, lost in a 20-year-old memory of spilled syrup and laughter. Now, here was a new ghost, a living one, asking for help. He took the note, he read it, and the world shifted on its axis. The past and the present collided in that greasy spoon over a plate of cold pancakes. The flu, the flat tire, a series of random chances had just delivered a declaration of war into the one pair of hands in the whole God-forsaken town that knew exactly what to do with it. He didn't smile. He didn't offer false comfort. He made a silent promise, and then he spoke the 4 words that would change everything. I believe you. The whisper had found its amplifier. Grizz did not go to the police. He had learned that lesson in a courtroom filled with legal jargon and feigned sympathy, a place where his son's life was reduced to a case file number. The Havenwood Police Department would open an investigation. They would interview Finch, who would charm them. They would talk to Prentice, who would seem pathetic and harmless. They would require evidence, corroboration. They would treat Leo's story as the fantasy of a troubled child. The system, Grizz knew, was not built to catch whispers. It was built to crush them under the weight of its own bureaucracy. To get justice, you couldn't use the system's tools. You had to forge your own. From the diner, he didn't go back to his garage. He drove 20 miles east to a dusty, sun-bleached farmhouse owned by a man named Preacher. Preacher was the president of the local Hells Angels charter. He was a Vietnam veteran with a quiet demeanor and eyes that had seen too much. He was sitting on his porch, cleaning a shotgun, when Grizz's Harley pulled up. Grizz didn't waste time with pleasantries. He handed Preacher the note. Preacher read it, his weathered face impassive. He read it again, then slowly folded it and handed it back. A school? He asked, his voice a low gravel. Northwood Academy. For kids. The janitor? Yeah. You sure about the kid? Grizz just nodded. I'm sure. That was all the confirmation Preacher needed. The code was simple and absolute. You don't touch children. It was the one law that superseded all others. What do you need? Preacher asked. Witnesses, Grizz said. Not vigilantes. Witnesses. We need proof. Undeniable proof. We need to catch the ghost. Preacher nodded slowly, a plan already forming behind his eyes. He went inside and came back with a scarred, leather-bound address book and an old flip phone. He didn't just call his own charter. He called presidents in 3 neighboring states. He called the Diablos, the Vagos. He called a club of veterans who called themselves the Irregulars. He wasn't just activating a club. He was activating a network, a brotherhood of outsiders bound by a shared distrust of the official world and a fierce, often violent code of honor. The message was the same each time. It's a code 1. For a child, we need watchers, eyes and ears, no colors, no noise, just bodies. The number of men and women who answered the call was 182. It was a number that would become legend. They were not all bikers. They were mechanics, construction workers, ex-cops, even a disgruntled IT specialist who had once been fired for hacking his boss's email. They were a collection of the forgotten and the furious. The next step was to find their insiders. They couldn't just storm the school. They needed access. Grizz thought about the systems that fail, the police, the administration. But what about the other people inside? The ones who, like the children, were invisible, the cooks, the cleaners, the groundskeepers. He found his first ally in the last place anyone would look, the bingo hall at the local church. Her name was Maria Rodriguez. She was 64 years old and had been a lunch lady at Northwood for 12 years. Grizz had seen her at the diner sometimes, her face etched with a permanent weariness. He approached her after her game, showing her nothing but the note. He didn't have to explain. She read it, and her hand went to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew something was wrong. The way some of them won't eat, the fear in their eyes. I told my supervisor once. He told me to mind my own business, or I'd be out of a job. I have 2 grandchildren to support. What could I do?" "This," Grizz said softly. "You can do this." Maria became their way in. She knew the building's blind spots. She knew the staff rotation schedules. She knew about the old, unused service tunnels in the basement. Their second ally was harder to find. They needed someone who understood evidence, someone who could ensure that what they collected would be admissible, undeniable. Grizz found him through an old army buddy. His name was Frank Miller, a retired detective who had been forced out of the Havenwood PD for pushing too hard on a case involving a city councilman's son. He was bitter, drowning his pension in cheap whiskey, a man whose belief in justice had been systematically dismantled. Grizz met him at a dive bar. He laid out the plan. Frank listened, cynical and dismissive at first. "You're talking about illegal surveillance, breaking and entering. You'll all end up in jail, and the janitor will walk." "No," Grizz corrected him. "We're talking about concerned citizens gathering evidence of a crime in progress that the authorities have refused to investigate. We're not going to be the arresting officers. We're just going to be the witnesses. We'll have you on the line. When we have the proof, you make the call. You bring them in. We just hold the scene. Cleanly." Frank was silent for a long time, staring into his glass. He saw a chance, not just to nail a predator, but to stick a thumb in the eye of the very system that had discarded him. A chance at redemption. "All right," he said, his voice rusty. "I'm in, but you do it my way. We need high-resolution night vision cameras, pinhole lenses, we need directional microphones, and we need a chain of custody for the evidence that a first-year law student couldn't tear apart. The IT specialist, a man who went by the name Glitch, sourced the equipment online, paying with a series of untraceable prepaid gift cards. 6 miniature cameras, no bigger than a shirt button. 4 sensitive audio recorders. They were delivered to a P.O. box in a neighboring town. The total cost was $4,728, paid for by contributions from a dozen different charters, a collection plate passed around for justice. The plan was meticulous. Maria would smuggle the equipment into the school in a bulk container of flour. During her late shift, she would plant the cameras, one in the air vent across from Leo's room, one behind a loose tile in the ceiling at the far end of Blue Hall, one disguised as a smoke detector in the center of the corridor. The audio recorders would be placed to capture the faintest sounds. The feeds would be transmitted wirelessly to a receiver in a van parked just outside the school's property line. Frank and Grizz would monitor the feeds. The 180 others would form the perimeter. They would be the net. The silent, waiting net. The week leading up to the operation was a study in controlled tension. It was a slow, agonizing crawl toward midnight on a Friday. Maria, her hands trembling but her resolve firm, executed her part perfectly. On a Tuesday night, while cleaning the kitchen after a spaghetti dinner, she slipped away. She moved through the darkened school, a ghost on a mission. She knew the building better than anyone, better even than Prentice. She knew the squeaky floorboards to avoid, the cameras that were dummies, the service shafts that ran between the walls. She planted the 6 cameras and 4 microphones in 47 minutes. When she returned to the kitchen, no one had noticed she was gone. She was just the lunch lady, invisible. The next day, Glitch and 2 other bikers, disguised as city utility workers, did a routine check on a telephone pole across the street. They installed a signal booster, ensuring the wireless feed from the cameras would be strong and clear. They were done in 20 minutes. Grizz needed to see Leo one more time. He needed to give him something. A promise. He couldn't risk the diner again. He learned from Maria that Leo's class had a supervised nature walk in the woods behind the school every Thursday at 2 p.m. Grizz was there, deep in the trees, looking like a hiker who had lost his way. He caught Leo's eye as the line of children shuffled past. The teacher, a harried man who was more interested in his phone, didn't notice. Leo, seeing Grizz, feigned a stomachache and fell to the back of the line. Grizz stepped out from behind an old oak tree. He knelt, bringing his massive frame down to the boy's level. He didn't speak for a moment. He just looked at Leo, his gaze steady. "We're coming," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Soon. I need you to be brave for just a little longer. Can you do that?" Leo nodded, his eyes wide. Grizz reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth black stone. It was a worry stone, worn down from years of being turned over and over in his own pocket. It was cool to the touch. "Hold on to this," he said, pressing it into Leo's small hand and closing his fingers around it. "It's a promise. As long as you have this, you know we are watching. Not him. Us. We are watching. We will not let anything happen to you." It was an open loop, a physical manifestation of a vow. Leo clutched the stone. It felt heavy, real, solid. It was the first solid thing he had felt in a long time. He slipped it into his pocket, a secret anchor against the coming tide. "Okay," Grizz said, his voice softening. "Now get back in line before they miss you." As Leo ran to catch up, Grizz watched him go. He saw the slight straightening of the boy's shoulders. It was a tiny change, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was hope. Meanwhile, the network was mobilizing. The 182 witnesses began to arrive in Havenwood, not in a great swarm, but in 2s and 3s. They stayed in cheap motels on the outskirts of town, paying in cash. They were a silent, temporary army, their presence unnoticed by the town. They met in a rented warehouse near the rail yard. Inside, under the bare bulbs, they went over the plan. Preacher and Frank Miller addressed the assembly. Frank's voice was sharp, clinical. "This is not a party. This is not a beatdown. This is an evidence-gathering operation. Your job is containment and containment only. You will form a perimeter. You will be silent. You will be invisible. No colors. No weapons. The only weapons we are using tonight are these," he said, holding up one of the tiny cameras. "Anyone who breaks protocol, anyone who lays a hand on this scumbag before the police arrive, is a liability. You will be dealt with. Understood?" A low murmur of assent went through the crowd. These were not street thugs. They were disciplined men and women, many of them ex-military, who understood the importance of a clear chain of command and a precise mission objective. Grizz then stood up. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just told them about the note. He told them about the look in the boy's eyes. "This isn't about us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is for all the kids who whispered for help and no one heard them. Tonight, we hear them. Tonight, we are the ones who listen." The air in the warehouse was still. The weight of their purpose settled over them. They were not just there to catch a predator. They were there to right a cosmic wrong. They were there to stand in the gap for a child the world had left behind. They were the impossible made real, a force forged in the fires of systemic failure, waiting for the cover of darkness. The clock was ticking. Friday was almost here. Friday, 10:53 p.m. The temperature was 34 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. A sharp wind from the north rattled the bare branches of the oak trees lining the long driveway to Northwood Academy. The moon was a pale, broken fingernail in the inky sky. Inside the school, the 9 p.m. bells had long since faded. The 42 children in the residential wing were in their beds. The lights were out. The building was settling into the deep, false quiet of the night. 1.2 miles away, in the parking lot of a closed-down textile mill, 182 engines were cut in near unison. The sudden silence was more profound than the preceding roar. There were no loud words, no boastful laughter, just the soft crunch of boots on gravel, the creak of leather, the low, murmured confirmations of readiness. They moved out on foot, melting into the shadows along the side of the road, a river of dark shapes flowing toward the hill. They were the antibodies, drawn to the site of an infection. At 11:17 p.m., they reached the perimeter of the school grounds. They fanned out with practiced military precision, forming a circle 300 yards in diameter around the main residential building. Every exit was covered. Every window was in someone's line of sight. They communicated with hand signals and clicks on their encrypted radios. A man who had been a Marine Scout sniper took a position in a tree, not with a rifle, but with a pair of high-powered binoculars. His job was to watch the watchers. At 11:28 p.m., a nondescript white utility van, the kind that blends in everywhere and is noticed by no one, pulled into a small, unlit service road behind a row of overgrown hedges. It had a perfect view of the academy's residential wing. The engine was cut. Inside, the only light came from the glow of 3 monitors. Grizz sat in the driver's seat, his big hands resting on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He stared at the main building, a dark brick monolith against the night sky. Beside him, Frank Miller, the ex-detective, adjusted the audio levels, his face illuminated by the green lines of the sound waves dancing on his screen. The images from the 6 cameras flickered to life. Camera 1, Blue Hall, North End. "Clear," Frank murmured. Camera 2, Blue Hall, South End. "Clear." Camera 3, Central Corridor. "We have a visual. It's him." On the main monitor, a grainy black and white figure appeared, Arthur Prentice. He was pushing his cleaning cart, his movements unhurried. The directional microphone picked up the faint squeak of a wheel and the soft, rhythmic jingle of his keys. The sound was monstrous. In the back of the van, a third person sat in darkness, wrapped in a blanket. It was Sarah Jenkins, Leo's mother. Grizz and Preacher had pooled their money, bought her a last-minute plane ticket, and picked her up from the airport themselves. Frank had argued against it. She was a civilian, a liability. But Grizz had been adamant. "She has to be here," he had said. "She has to be the one to see it. She has to be the one to give the word. This is her fight too. We're just the weapon." Sarah stared at the monitor, her body trembling. She watched the man who had soothed her fears on the phone. The man who had promised her son was in the best possible hands. She was watching him move toward her son's room. She put a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob, her breath fogging in the cold air of the van. The timestamps on the screen were a brutal, relentless countdown. 11:47 p.m. Prentice stops his cart at the end of Blue Hall. He consults his small notebook. 11:49 p.m. He begins to walk down the hall. He is no longer pushing the cart. His hands are empty, except for the ring of keys he jingles softly as he walks. He is walking toward the quiet rooms. Grizz's voice crackled over the radio, a whisper to the 181 listeners spread out in the darkness. Stand by. Target is mobile. Sarah watched, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She saw him stop outside room 19, Anna's room. The camera angle was perfect. It showed his hand, the key, the lock. It showed the door opening. It showed him slipping inside. "What is he doing?" she whispered, her voice ragged. Frank zoomed in the camera feed from the hallway. "Just wait," he said, his voice grim. The door to room 19 remained slightly ajar. For 1 minute, 2, 3 agonizing minutes. Nothing happened. There was no sound. Then, the door closed with a soft click. Prentice emerged and continued down the hall. He hadn't touched the girl. He hadn't done anything that would leave a mark. He had just stolen 3 minutes of her safety, 3 minutes of her childhood. And it was enough. It was everything. He stopped again, this time outside room 17. Leo's room. Sarah let out a small, strangled gasp. Grizz reached over and put a heavy hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, a promise. The camera hidden in the air vent gave them a clear view. The key slid into the lock. The knob turned. The door opened. The sliver of light cut across the floor. Prentice stood in the doorway, a dark shape against the dim light of the hall. The infrared camera showed Leo in his bed, a small, still form. He wasn't moving. He was pretending to be asleep, his body rigid with terror. In his hand, hidden under the blanket, he was clutching a small, smooth stone. Prentice stood there, watching. The seconds stretched into an eternity. 10 seconds, 20, 30. On the monitor, Frank highlighted the time code. "We have him," he said, his voice cold and precise. "Unlawful entry, trespassing, stalking a minor. It's more than enough. It's airtight." Sarah watched the silhouette of the man in her son's doorway. She saw not just a janitor, but every lie she had been told, every fear she had suppressed, every doubt she had dismissed. The rage that rose in her was pure and cleansing. It burned away the guilt and the fear. "Get him," she whispered, her voice no longer trembling, but hard as steel. Grizz looked at her, saw the fire in her eyes, and nodded. He picked up the radio handset. His thumb depressed the button. He spoke a single word into the darkness, a word that was both a command and a release. "Now." The word traveled through the cold night air, a spark igniting a carefully laid fuse. For the 181 witnesses spread around the school, it was the signal they had been waiting for. But there was no sudden rush, no chaotic charge. The response was as disciplined and precise as everything that had come before it. A team of 12, designated as the entry team, detached from the perimeter. Grizz was at their head. They moved from the tree line to the building, their feet making almost no sound on the damp grass. They did not break a window or kick down a door. Maria, the lunch lady, had provided them with more than just information. She had given them a key, a master key to the service entrances, one she had lost a decade ago and the school had never bothered to replace. At 12:03 a.m., they slipped into the building through a basement door, emerging into the tomb-like silence of the ground floor. They moved up a service stairwell, their movements economical and swift. They were a dozen shadows detaching from the greater darkness. Upstairs in the van, Frank Miller was already on the phone. He wasn't calling 911. He was calling the personal cell phone of the one man on the Havenwood force he still trusted, Sergeant Bill Connolly, a 20-year veteran just 2 years from retirement, a man who had seen the system fail one too many times himself. "Bill, it's Frank. I've got a Class A felony in progress at Northwood Academy. Child endangerment. I have live video evidence. I need you and only you. No sirens until you're on the property. I have the scene contained. The suspect is a male, 50s, janitorial staff. Name's Prentice. He's in Blue Hall. And Frank, the place is surrounded. Tell your guys to come in slow and easy. My people are disciplined, but they're not saints." On the monitor, Prentice was still standing in Leo's doorway. He had been there for a full minute and 47 seconds. Then something seemed to spook him. A floorboard creaking downstairs, a shift in the wind. He pulled the door shut, the click of the lock echoing in the van's small space. He turned and started walking back down the hall, his pace slightly quicker now. Grizz's team emerged from the stairwell at the far end of Blue Hall, blocking his path. Prentice stopped dead. His face, illuminated by the dim emergency lights, registered confusion first, then a dawning, sickening fear. He saw a dozen large, silent figures standing between him and the exit. At the front was Grizz, a mountain of leather and denim, his face set like granite. Prentice's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His watery eyes darted from side to side, looking for an escape that wasn't there. He looked like what he was, a pathetic, cornered little man, the banality of evil made manifest in a cheap blue uniform. No one on the entry team spoke. They didn't threaten him. They didn't touch him. They simply stood there, an immovable wall of silent judgment. Grizz took one slow step forward. Prentice flinched back, his hand instinctively going to the ring of keys on his belt. He fumbled with them, his fingers suddenly clumsy. The brass ring slipped from its clip, falling to the polished linoleum floor with a loud metallic clatter that echoed down the empty hall like a gunshot. The sound of his power, his secret weapon, now just a useless jumble of metal at his feet. He looked down at the keys, then back up at Grizz. The last of his composure crumbled. A small whimpering sound escaped his lips. The camera in the smoke detector captured it all. The fear, the collapse, the final, pathetic stripping away of his authority. Grizz just looked at him, his expression a mixture of contempt and a deep, weary sadness. He had seen monsters before, in jungles and deserts. They were never as frightening as the ones who hid in plain sight, the ones who preyed on the helpless. 2 minutes later, the entry team heard the soft crunch of tires on the driveway. Sergeant Connolly had arrived. He came into the hall alone, his hand not on his weapon, but held up in a gesture of peace. He saw Prentice huddled against the wall. He saw the dozen silent figures. He saw Grizz. "He's all yours, Sergeant," Grizz said, his voice a low rumble. "We have the footage. Everything." Connolly nodded. He walked past Grizz, pulled out his handcuffs, and approached the whimpering janitor. "Arthur Prentice, you are under arrest for breaking and entering, stalking. The list is long, Arthur. You have the right to remain silent." As Connolly led Prentice away, the janitor looked back at Grizz, his face a mask of disbelief and pleading. "Why?" he seemed to be asking. Grizz didn't answer. He just turned and walked away. The ghosts were quiet. The debt was paid. Outside, the 182 witnesses began to melt back into the darkness as silently as they had arrived. Their job was done. By the time the first official patrol cars, sirens now blaring, screamed up the driveway. The only evidence that the Phantom Army had ever been there was a single, fresh tire track on the shoulder of the road and a janitor in handcuffs, his world utterly and completely destroyed by a whisper that had finally found its roar. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The arrest of Arthur Prentice was a lit match dropped into a silo of gasoline. Sergeant Connolly, armed with Frank Miller's meticulously documented video evidence, bypassed the local prosecutor's office, which he knew Finch had in his pocket. He took the case directly to the state attorney general. The footage was undeniable. It was a silent, grainy horror film that no one could look away from. Within 72 hours, Northwood Academy was swarmed, not by bikers, but by state investigators, social workers, and forensic accountants. Alistair Finch's carefully constructed world imploded. His initial response was one of indignant bluster. He called Prentice a rogue employee, a lone wolf, a terrible, isolated tragedy. He tried to frame the school as another victim. It didn't work. The investigation uncovered Ms. Albright's initial report, buried in Finch's desk drawer. They found a dozen other similar concerns, all logged and dismissed over the past decade. They discovered that Finch had actively suppressed at least 4 prior complaints about Prentice, threatening the jobs of the staff members who had brought them forward. The financial audit revealed that Finch had been embezzling funds for years, billing the state for specialized therapeutic services that were never rendered. The manicured lawns and polished floors were a facade, hiding a core of rot and neglect. Finch was arrested a week later, led from his mahogany-paneled office in handcuffs. The charge sheet was long: obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, fraud, and 27 counts of criminal child endangerment. The brand he had so carefully managed was now a national disgrace. Northwood Academy was shut down, its license permanently revoked. The brick building on the hill became a monument to systemic failure, its windows soon boarded up, its lawns growing wild. The story hit the news, but the narrative was controlled. The official version spoke of an anonymous tip from a concerned citizens group that had led to the investigation. The bikers wanted it that way. They hadn't acted for credit or glory. They had acted for justice, and justice had been served. They faded back into the landscape, their secret safe. For the children, the end of Northwood was the beginning of a long, difficult healing process. They were taken from the school and placed in temporary foster care, or returned to families who were now confronted with the terrible truth of what had happened. Therapists and counselors, the part of the system that was meant to heal rather than punish, finally stepped in. They listened to the stories the children had been trying to tell for years. Stories of a man with keys, of a shadow in the doorway, of a fear so profound it had stolen their voices. Leo was reunited with his mother at the airport. Sarah ran to him, dropping to her knees and wrapping him in an embrace so tight it felt like she was trying to fuse him back into her own body. She sobbed into his hair, repeating the same words over and over. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I believe you." He didn't speak, but for the first time in a year, he hugged her back. He buried his face in her shoulder, and his small body shook with the release of 1,000 silent screams. In his pocket, his hand was wrapped tightly around a smooth black stone. 1 year later, the world is a different color. The gray pall of fear has been replaced by the bright, chaotic hues of a normal life. Leo is 9 years old now. He lives with his mother in a small, bright apartment 200 miles from Havenwood. He goes to a public school. He has friends. He plays soccer in the park, and the sound of his laughter is a common and beautiful thing. He still has nightmares sometimes, but they are fading, the edges smoothed away by time and safety. On a bright Saturday morning, he is not in a diner. He is in a garage that smells of oil and hot metal, resurrection motors. He and Sarah drive here once a month. It's a pilgrimage. Leo is meticulously polishing the chrome fender of a 1972 Harley-Davidson shovelhead. He works with a focused intensity, making the metal gleam. Grizz sits on a stool nearby, watching him. He's cleaning carburetor parts in a pan of solvent, his large hands surprisingly delicate. The garage is full of men, members of the club, working on their bikes. They are loud and rough, but when they speak to Leo, their voices soften. They call him Little Man. They treat him with a gruff, gentle reverence. He is not afraid of them. He is not afraid of the noise. He knows what they are. They are his protectors, his tribe, his found family. The 182 witnesses did not just disappear. They became a network. They started a foundation, funded quietly by a dozen charters and 100 small businesses. They call it the Watchers. It pays for therapy for the Northwood kids. It helps their families with legal fees and relocation costs. It has a private, anonymous hotline, a number passed by word of mouth among those who have reason to believe a child is in a quiet room somewhere, unheard. They became the system that works. Sarah comes over and hands Grizz a cup of coffee. She watches her son, a real, genuine smile on her face. "Thank you," she says to Grizz. It's a simple phrase she has said 100 times, but it is filled with a universe of meaning. Grizz just nods, taking a sip of the coffee. He looks at Leo. "We all had a debt to pay," he says quietly. Later that afternoon, back in his own room, Leo stands by his window. The sun is streaming in. On his windowsill, next to a model airplane and a collection of colorful rocks, sits a single, smooth, black stone. It catches the afternoon light, a small, dark anchor in a sea of brightness. A promise kept. And so, we are left with this, a story of darkness and light, a story of a system that failed, and a brotherhood that rose to meet the moment. It is easy to look at the world and see only the locked doors, the indifferent authorities, the polished lies of men like Alistair Finch. It is easy to believe that evil is a powerful, unstoppable force. But look closer. Look at the lunch lady who risked her job to plant a camera. Look at the retired cop who chose one last righteous fight over a bitter retirement. Look at the 182 men and women who rode through the night, not for vengeance, but to bear witness. And look at a small boy who, armed with nothing but a piece of paper and a sliver of courage, walked across a diner and whispered his truth to a stranger. The world is saved not by grand gestures, but by small, defiant acts, by the choice to listen when it would be easier to ignore, by the decision to stand up when everyone else remains seated. The monsters are real. They mow their lawns and smile at their neighbors. They hold positions of trust and wear the uniforms of authority. But they are not invincible. Their greatest power is our silence. Their greatest weakness is a single unified voice that says, "No more." So, listen. Listen for the whispers from the quiet rooms. Look for the fear in a child's eyes. Do not turn away. Do not convince yourself it is not your problem. You do not need a leather jacket or a motorcycle to be a protector. You just need to be willing to see what is right in front of you and have the courage to do something, to be a witness, to be the one who says, "I believe you." Because in the end, that is how the darkness is pushed back. Not with a roar, but with a whisper that is finally heard.